My name is Kate McKinnon, and I'm 39 years old. 7 years ago, my younger sister stood in my parents' kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, poured herself a glass of orange juice, and told them I had been fired from my residency program for stealing medication from the hospital pharmacy. She said it so calmly, so specifically, with so many fabricated details, that my parents never once thought to pick up the phone and call me first. They cut off my phone plan that same afternoon. My mother sent a single text before the number was disconnected. "We raised you better than this. Don't contact us until you're ready to confess and make this right." My father didn't send anything at all. 3 weeks later, I received a certified letter from their attorney informing me that I was no longer listed as a beneficiary in either of their wills, and that any future contact I attempted would be considered harassment. I was in my 2nd year of surgical residency at Johns Hopkins. I had never stolen anything in my life. I had never even taken a pen from a hotel room without feeling guilty about it. I didn't know what Vanessa had told them, not the specifics, not yet. I just knew that one morning I woke up as a daughter, and by evening I was something else entirely. Something expelled, something returned to sender without being opened. Then 3 months ago, my sister was brought into the Johns Hopkins emergency department by ambulance at 2:47 in the morning. She had a ruptured appendix and early-stage peritonitis, and by the time the attending on call reached the surgical floor, I was already scrubbing in. Before we get into what happened in that OR, let me tell you about the life I lived before my sister decided to dismantle it, because I think that part matters more than most people realize. The betrayal is just one moment in time, the soil it grew in that took 32 years to cultivate. I grew up in a 3-bedroom ranch house on Clover Hill Drive in a suburb of Columbus, where the lawns were always perfectly edged, and nobody ever talked about the things that actually mattered. My father, Robert McKinnon, was a civil engineer who worked long hours and communicated primarily through silence, and occasionally through very loud silences that were worse. My mother, Patricia, ran a small interior design business from a converted sunroom, and had a talent for making everything in the house look curated and intentional, including her children, which I mean in the least flattering way possible. There were 3 of us, me the oldest by 4 years, then my brother Daniel, who died of a congenital heart defect at age 2 when I was 5 years old. His death is not something my family ever processed out loud. He became a presence in our house, a kind of sacred absence that shaped everything after it without anyone ever acknowledging its shape. My mother kept his room exactly as it was until I was 12 years old, and then one day I came home from school, and the room was an office with taupe walls and a filing cabinet. She never mentioned it. I understood, even at 12, that some griefs are too large for words, and so they get rerouted into silence. Then there was Vanessa, 4 years younger than me, which made her 8 when Daniel's room became an office, young enough to have no real memory of him. Vanessa was born with a particular kind of magnetism that I have spent 30 years trying to name accurately without sounding envious, because the truth is more complicated than envy. She was bright and funny, and she had our father's dark eyes and our mother's gift for presenting herself, and from the time she was small she understood intuitively how to be seen in a room in the way that some people just know, the way a sunflower knows which direction to turn. It wasn't a performance, it was just her. She was genuinely charming. I was not charming, I was careful. I want to make sure I describe myself accurately here, because the story only makes sense if you understand what I was. I wasn't a miserable child. I wasn't the sad, overlooked kid eating lunch alone in every cafeteria, though there were days that came close. I was quiet in the way that children are quiet when they've decided that being noticed isn't safe. I was good at school in the way that children are good at school when school is the only arena where they control the outcome. I made straight A's from 3rd grade onward, not because I was performing for anyone, but because each A felt like a small, private victory over a world that otherwise seemed to grade me invisible. My parents loved me. I want to be clear about that too. This isn't a story about parents who didn't love their child. This is a story about parents who loved their child the way you love a houseplant, glad it's there, relieved when it doesn't need anything, vaguely proud when it blooms, but not particularly interested in understanding how it grows. My mother would forget things, not big things, not at first. She forgot that my 7th grade science fair project was on the Thursday, not the Friday. She came on Friday, stood in the gymnasium in her good coat, looked at the empty tables and the janitor sweeping the floor and said, "Oh, Kate, I had it in my calendar wrong." And that was it. No real apology, no acknowledgement of the trophy I had won the day before without either parent present. The next morning she made Belgian waffles and nobody mentioned it. She forgot my piano recital senior year of high school. This one I know was not a mistake because I had written the date in 3 separate places: the kitchen calendar, the whiteboard on the refrigerator, and a sticky note on her desk in the sunroom. I performed Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major to a half-empty auditorium while Vanessa sat in the front row, 13 years old and wearing a headband with a flower on it, the only member of my family who showed up. She held a little bouquet of carnations she had bought with her allowance. I have never entirely forgiven my parents for that day, but I have also never forgotten Vanessa's carnations, and that is part of what makes this story so complicated. My father's forgetting was different. His was less about dates and more about me specifically. He was present at Vanessa's soccer games with a lawn chair and a thermos. He came to one of mine and spent most of the time on his phone. He helped Vanessa with her history paper on the civil rights movement. When I needed help with a chemistry problem set in 10th grade, he looked at it, said I'm an engineer, not a chemist, and went back to the game he was watching. He wasn't a bad father. He was a distracted one in ways that had a specific direction. I'm not trying to argue that Vanessa was deliberately favored as a child or that my parents set out to create the dynamic between us. I think it was more organic and therefore more difficult to combat. Vanessa was easier to be around. She laughed at my father's jokes. She went shopping with my mother. She filled silences naturally, effortlessly, in the way that I never could because silence had always felt to me like something to respect, not eliminate. And when you live in a house with grief that can't be spoken, the child who makes noise is easier to love than the child who simply witnesses. I understand this now. When I was 17, it mostly just felt like I was wrong in some way I couldn't identify or fix. The moment I decided to become a surgeon happened in a way that I've never fully explained to anyone. My junior year of high school, I shadowed a doctor for a career day program at Columbus Children's Hospital. The doctor was a pediatric surgeon named Dr. Reeves, a small, compact woman with short grey hair who moved through that hospital like she owned the molecular structure of the place. I followed her on rounds and watched her tell a family that their 5-year-old's prognosis was better than expected after surgery that morning, and I watched the mother's face do something I can only describe as the face of someone being returned from exile. Just that. Just the face of someone being told they could stay. I thought, standing in that hospital corridor at 17, I want to be able to give people that. Not because I was noble. Because I understood, even then, what it felt like to be in exile inside your own house, and I thought that if I could give other people the opposite of that feeling, maybe I was worth something after all. So I studied. I studied with a ferocity that my teachers occasionally found alarming, and my parents found vaguely impressive in the way they found most things about me vaguely impressive, at a comfortable distance, with minimal sustained interest. I got a 4 throughout high school. I ran cross-country because it was the one sport where you could suffer in near solitude, and people would respect you for it. I volunteered at the hospital every summer from age 16 onward. I applied to colleges with the same strategic thoroughness I applied to everything, and I got into Ohio State on a merit scholarship that covered 80% of my tuition. My father, when he heard, said, "That's really something, Katie." He was watching a baseball game. My mother hugged me and cried, and that part was real. I believe that part was genuinely real. And Vanessa, 13 years old and already starting to understand the geometry of our family, said, "I knew you would. You're the smartest person I know." She meant it then. I'm almost certain she meant it then. Ohio State was the first place I ever felt like myself. This sounds like hyperbole, but I want to try to explain it accurately. When you grow up in a house where you are loved but invisible, you develop a very specific kind of relationship with your own personality. You keep it mostly private. You share it in small, controlled doses. You learn to read rooms before entering them and to modulate yourself accordingly. What Ohio State did was give me rooms where the modulating wasn't necessary. Rooms full of people who were interested in the same things I was interested in, who got excited about anatomy and organic chemistry and the mechanical elegance of how bodies work. I had friends for the first time in any real sense, not the careful, peripheral friendships of high school where you're always slightly outside the circle, but actual friendships with depth and history to them. My roommate freshman year was a woman named Carla Torres from Cleveland who was pre-law and deeply funny and who taught me that dinner didn't have to be a performance you prepared for. We just ate dinner. We just talked. She would tell me about her family and I would tell her about mine, and she would listen in the specific, quiet way that real friends listen, which is to say she listened without trying to fix anything. I also, for the first time, had the sustained attention of an adult who saw me clearly. Dr. Theodore Hamlin was my biochemistry professor sophomore year, and then my undergraduate research mentor through the rest of college. He was 62, tall, dry-humored, deeply committed to precision in all things, and he had a gift for identifying students who were trying harder than they were being seen. He pulled me aside after I scored a 99 on my second exam in his course, and said without preamble, "You're going to medical school. Have you thought about which specialty?" I said surgery, and he nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already decided. He wrote my first letter of recommendation. He was the first adult in my life who treated my ambitions as facts rather than aspirations. When I was applying to medical school's junior year, and panicking in the way that pre-med students panic, which is entirely and constantly, he sat across his desk from me and said, "Kate, you are not someone who will be hopping to get in. You are someone programs will be hopping to get." I want to convey how seismic that sentence was. Not because I was starved for praise. I had gotten plenty of good grades and enough external validation to function, but because he said it without needing anything from me in return. It was a fact being stated by someone with no investment in making me feel better. It was the most honest sentence anyone had said to me in years. I got into 6 medical schools. When I got the Johns Hopkins acceptance, I sat in my apartment in Columbus and cried for 20 minutes and then called my parents. My mother cried too. My father said, "Hopkins, that's the best, isn't it?" I said yes. He said, "Well, that's really something." Same words he'd used when I got into Ohio State. Different feeling though, that time he'd turned back to the game. This time there was a pause before the silence, a pause that felt like genuine awe, and I held onto that pause for a long time afterward. Vanessa was 17 when I got into Hopkins. She was in her junior year of high school and already brilliant in her own particular way, charming and quick and very good at English and drama and completely uninterested in anything I was doing. We texted occasionally. She called me on my birthday. We were not close in the way sisters can be close, but we were not hostile either. We were orbiting each other at a respectful distance that I assumed in my naivety would close with time. I moved to Baltimore in August. I remember the drive, my car packed with boxes, Carla helping me load and then hugging me for a long time in the parking lot of our apartment building. She said, "You are going to be so good at this." I drove the 6 hours through Ohio and Pennsylvania with the windows down and the radio loud and something in my chest that felt, for the first time in years, like genuine forward motion. Medical school is a thing I will not attempt to fully describe here because that would be its own 25,000 words, and most of them would be about exhaustion. What I will say is that I was built for it, not because I was smarter than everyone else. I was not at Hopkins, where everyone had been the smartest person in their previous world, but because I had spent 30 years practicing the kind of sustained, focused discipline that medical school requires. I knew how to work in silence. I knew how to persist without external validation. I knew how to metabolize setbacks and return to the problem. These are not qualities that make you likable at cocktail parties. They are qualities that make you a good doctor. I did my clinical rotations in 3rd and 4th year, and the surgical rotations lit something in me that I can only describe as recognition. Standing in an OR for the first time with a retractor in my hands, watching the attending peel back layers of tissue with the kind of confidence that comes only from 10,000 hours of practice, I understood in my body rather than my mind that this was the thing I was going to do with my life. There is a precision to surgery that satisfies something in me that nothing else has ever satisfied, the knowledge that every movement matters, that the margin between the right incision and the wrong one is measured in millimeters, that the outcome of every case is a direct function of your preparation and your judgment and your hands. My hands, it turned out, were exceptional. My attending said so without embarrassment, which is not how surgeons typically give compliments. The chief of surgery during my 4th year rotation, a man named Dr. Paul Chen, who had the bedside manner of a particularly impatient glacier, watched me complete a simulated laparoscopic procedure and then said flatly, "Good hands. Don't waste them." I kept that too. I matched into my first choice for residency, Hopkins General Surgery. I was 26 years old and I had worked for every single step of it, and I was proud in a way that I did not know how to express, and so I mostly did not express it. I called my parents. My mother cried again. My father said, "Hopkins again. You're loyal." He laughed at his own joke. I laughed too. The residency is where Vanessa comes back into the story. She was 22 when I started my residency. She had gone to Ohio State too, studying communications, and she was living with our parents while she figured out the next thing, a decision that seemed fine at the time, and which I now understand was the beginning of a very long period of Vanessa figuring out the next thing while living off of the resources of people who loved her. I want to be careful here not to characterize her unfairly, because I think Vanessa's patterns were not malicious in their origin. I think she was someone who had never been asked to build anything from the ground up, who had always lived in the warmth of other people's attention, and who had developed, over time, a subtle dependency on that warmth that made her do things she might not otherwise have done. We talked on the phone maybe once a month. She told me about her job applications, her dating life, a road trip she had taken with friends. I told her about residency, the cases, the exhaustion, the learning. She was interested in my stories in the way that people are interested in things that are very far from their own experience, genuinely curious but with no skin in the game. She asked good questions. She remembered details. She told me once that she was proud of me, and I believed her. Looking back, I was feeding her ammunition. I just didn't know it yet. My first year of residency was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I include in that assessment what happened after. The hours were barbaric in the way that surgical residency hours are barbaric, which is to say legally capped but practically unbounded. I was post-call and running on 3 hours of sleep more often than not, learning to function at a cognitive level that would have terrified any reasonable person. Operating on the knowledge that the person across the drape from me was trusting me with their life, and that my tiredness was simply not relevant information. I loved it completely and exhaustedly, and with the full force of everything I had. My program director was a woman named Dr. Miriam Okafor, and she is one of the most significant people in my life. She was in her early 50s, Nigerian-American, with a reputation for rigor that had been built over 20 years and a warmth that she kept carefully rationed for those she trusted. She took me aside after my first month and said something that I have thought about regularly for 15 years. I see how hard you work. Now I need you to learn how to let it look easy. Surgeons who let their effort show make patients nervous. It was practical advice and it was also philosophy. It shaped how I move through operating rooms. I got through my first year. I got through my second year. And then in the spring of my second year, when I was 28 years old and bone-tired and prouder of myself than I had ever been, my sister told my parents I had been fired. I need to stop here for a moment and tell you what I know about why she did it, which I did not fully understand until much later. Vanessa, at 24, had been cycling through jobs, a brief stint at a PR firm, a few months doing social media for a restaurant group, a position at a non-profit that ended after 6 months. None of these were failures exactly, but none of them were building toward anything either, and my parents had started to ask questions. Not cruel questions, not even particularly pointed ones, but the kind of questions that accumulate into pressure. What's the plan, Vanessa? What are you working toward? Kate has her path, what's yours? I know this because my mother, years later, told me with a kind of exhausted honesty that Vanessa had come to her in tears one evening and said, "Every time I try to talk to you about my life, you bring up Kate. I can't compete with Kate. I can never be good enough because Kate is always there." And my mother, who loved her younger daughter, and who had spent 20 years overcompensating for the attention that grief and temperament had diverted from her older one, had held Vanessa and said, "You don't need to compete with anyone." But the words had already planted something. The genius of what Vanessa did, and I use that word with a disgust I've spent years learning to manage, was that she didn't invent something random. She invented something specific and plausible and just this side of verifiable. She told my parents I had been caught stealing fentanyl from the hospital pharmacy. She said she had spoken to someone at Hopkins, a friend of a friend who worked in administration, who had confirmed it. She said she hadn't wanted to tell them but that she was worried about me, that she thought I might have a problem, that she had tried to reach me, and I wasn't returning her calls. Every part of it was engineered to be believed. It was plausible because fentanyl theft happens in medicine, not often, not commonly, but enough that it lives in people's imaginations as a risk. It was specific enough to feel real, and it was framed in Vanessa's particular language of concern, which my parents had spent 20 years learning to receive as truth, because Vanessa's concern for people was one of her most visible qualities. My parents didn't call me first. This is the part I have returned to most often in the years since, the part I still find hardest to hold. They did not call me. They did not send an email. They did not give me the basic human courtesy of 20 seconds of direct communication before dismantling my relationship with them. Instead, my father called a law firm, apparently, and asked about liability, and then my mother sent me that text. "We raised you better than this. Don't contact us until you're ready to confess and make this right." I read that text standing in a hospital corridor in my scrubs at 11:30 at night after a 9-hour case, my feet aching, my mind running on fumes. I read it 3 times. And then I did something that I am still somehow proud of. I finished my shift. And then I went home and I sat in my apartment and I tried to understand what had happened. I called my mother's number. No answer. I called my father's number. No answer. I sent emails to both of them. Long, clear, specific emails explaining that I had no idea what they had been told but that I needed to speak to them, that whatever they believed had not happened, that I could provide documentation from Hopkins confirming my good standing in the program. The emails were delivered but not responded to. I called 14 times in the next 5 days. The first 3 calls to my mother's number went to voicemail, and I left messages that I tried to keep measured and clear. By the 4th call, her number was blocked. My father's numbers, his cell and the home line, went to voicemail all 5 days without ever being answered, and then on day 6 they were blocked too. I wrote a letter by hand, 4 pages. I included a printed letter on Hopkins' letterhead from the residency program administrator confirming that I was in good standing, that there had been no disciplinary action against me, that I was scheduled to continue in the program. I included my program director's direct phone number. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. The envelope came back 3 weeks later unopened, with return to sender written across the front, in handwriting I didn't recognize. I tried one more channel. My mother's sister, my Aunt Carol, who lived in Cincinnati and who I had always liked and who I thought might be willing to at least pass along information. I called her and explained the situation in as few words as possible. She listened. She said, "Oh, Katie, I'm so sorry. I'll try to talk to your mother." I thanked her. She called me back 2 days later and said, "I tried, honey. She won't hear it. She says she can't deal with this right now." She paused. "I believe you for what it's worth. It was worth something. It wasn't enough." 2 months after my mother's text, the certified letter from their attorney arrived. I read it and then I put it in a folder and I put the folder in my filing cabinet and I went back to work. I want to tell you what that period felt like because I think the easy version of this story skips past the texture of it. The easy version is, she was betrayed and she survived and she became successful. The texture is something else. The texture is this. For approximately 3 months after the certified letter arrived, I woke up every morning with a sensation in my chest that I have since diagnosed in retrospect as grief. Not the dramatic, operatic grief of the movies, not inconsolable weeping, but the low-grade, persistent grief that lives in the body, the way a chronic injury does, most of the time manageable, sometimes flaring without warning, always there if you press on it. I would be in the middle of a procedure and someone would say something offhand about calling their family, and there would be a brief, involuntary contraction somewhere behind my sternum, and then I would redirect and continue. This is not heroic. This is just what you do when you cannot afford to stop. A surgeon who stops mid-procedure because of a personal crisis is not a surgeon anymore, so I did not stop. I also, for 3 months, tried to understand what had happened at a level below the facts of it. I knew the facts. What I kept turning over was the why. Not Vanessa's why. I understood her why well enough by then, or I thought I did, the fear of being outpaced, the resentment that had built up under years of my parents' comparative attention, the particular desperation of someone who has never built their own foundation starting to pull at someone else's. What I couldn't understand was my parents. Why? My parents who had known me for 28 years. My parents who had watched me graduate high school and college and medical school and match into one of the best surgical residency programs in the country. My parents who had some basis, not a lot, I'll grant them that, but some, for trusting their older daughter's honesty. The answer I eventually arrived at, and it took me a long time to arrive there without bitterness, was that they believed Vanessa not because I was untrustworthy, but because the narrative was too easy. It slotted into a story they had already written without knowing they'd written it, the high-achieving child who flies too close to the sun, the daughter who left and became something unknowable. I had spent my entire life being proud to a family that didn't quite have the emotional vocabulary to receive it, and something in them, some quiet unfaced fear, had been waiting for the fall. I think, on some level, they found it easier to believe I had failed than to continue reckoning with the distance between us that my success had created. This is not an excuse. It is not forgiveness. It is just the most honest thing I can say about it. There was a person who got me through those months, and her name is Rosie Park. Rosie was a third-year resident in internal medicine when I met her, and we became friends the way that residents become friends, through shared suffering, through the bonding that happens when two people are awake at 3 a.m. in a hospital break room, drinking terrible coffee, and deciding whether to call an attending or wait until dawn. Rosie was Korean American, from Los Angeles, small and precise and funny in the pitch-black way that emergency medicine humor is funny, which is to say she could make you laugh about the most horrifying things. She was also, underneath the humor, the most emotionally intelligent person I had ever met. I told Rosie about my family 6 weeks after the certified letter arrived. We were sitting in the residence lounge after a long night and I just told her flatly the whole sequence of events, the way you tell a story you've been carrying for too long. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is the most specific, verifiable, clearly documented family betrayal I have ever heard." She paused. "Which means you tried everything you could and they chose not to believe you. That's on them." She didn't tell me to keep trying. She didn't tell me to forgive them. She didn't offer platitudes about family or time healing wounds. She just told me that the failure to believe me was theirs, not mine, and she said it like a diagnosis being stated, which was exactly the language I needed. Rosie became my chosen family over the next 7 years. She was at every milestone I had, every case I was proud of, every difficult day, the board exam, the completion of residency, the first attending position. She called me every Sunday morning. She flew to Baltimore for my fellowship graduation. She is the person I call when something large happens, and she has never once treated my calls as impositions. I want to say this clearly because I think it matters. Having someone in your life who chooses you, who shows up without obligation, and without the weight of shared history distorting every interaction, that is not a consolation prize for the family you lost. It is a different thing entirely. It is, in some ways, a better thing. It is love that is freely given in the most literal sense, untangled from blood and obligation and the 1,000 invisible debts that family relationships accumulate. Rosie did not love me because she was supposed to. She loved me because she decided to. That distinction, after the childhood I had, felt like clean water after a very long drought. Dr. Okafor also became, over the years, something between mentor and family. She had an investment in my development that went beyond professional interest. She treated my growth as something she had a stake in, and she communicated that through rigor rather than sentiment, which is how I prefer to receive most things. When I completed my 3rd year, and she told me I was one of the best technical residents she had trained in 15 years, I cried in my car afterward. Not because the praise was unexpected, exactly, but because it came from someone who had no reason to lie to me. I finished my residency. I completed a fellowship in minimally invasive and robotic surgery. I was offered and accepted an attending position at Johns Hopkins. I was 34 years old, and I was, by every external measure I could construct, exactly what I had set out to be. My parents had no idea. The years between 30 and 39, the years I lived without my family, were not years of absence. I want to be clear about this because I think people assume that losing your family of origin means living in a kind of perpetual waiting room, everything paused, some part of you always listening for the door. That was not my experience. My life in those years was full and purposeful and genuinely good in ways I had not anticipated and could not have built if I had spent them waiting. I taught medical students and residents with a ferocity that surprised even me. I had not known I would be good at teaching until I was doing it, and then I understood that what I was doing was showing people that they were capable of more than they thought, which is a form of care I have some personal familiarity with needing. I published research. I developed a technique for robotic-assisted Whipple procedures that reduced operative time by 20 minutes on average, and that my department head, with characteristic surgical understatement, described as *elegant. I bought an apartment in Fells Point, 3 blocks from the water. I decorated it in a way that had nothing to do with my mother's curated aesthetic. It was comfortable and slightly cluttered and full of books, and a large, badly painted landscape of the Chesapeake that I had bought from a street market, because it made me happy every time I looked at it. I had a life that was mine in the specific way that a life can only be yours when you've built it without anyone watching. I thought about my family every day. I want to be honest about that. Not all day, not in a consuming way, but in the way that an old injury is always present in your body. You know it's there, you've learned to move around it, and occasionally when the weather changes it announces itself. I thought about my parents at Thanksgiving, obviously, and Christmas, and my birthday in March when the card from Aunt Carol would arrive and remind me that the ones from my parents wouldn't. I thought about them sometimes in the OR when a family member was crying in the waiting room, and I was about to go tell them good news, and something in the space between those two things would contract briefly before I spoke. What I did not do was keep reaching out. I had tried. I had tried methodically and thoroughly and with documentation, and the attempt had been refused. There is a kind of dignity in knowing when to stop trying to enter a room where the lock has been changed. I had learned, over the course of 34 years, to husband my dignity carefully. I was not willing to beg. Vanessa reached out twice during those 7 years. Once a text message 3 years after the estrangement that read, "Hey, just thinking about you, hope you're okay." I stared at that text for a long time. I typed several responses and deleted them all. I didn't respond. The second time was a Facebook message that said, "I saw Mom and Dad recently. They're okay. I don't know if that matters to you, it does to me." I read that one too, and felt the specific complicated feeling that comes from knowing someone is watching the damage they've done and calling you cold for not thawing. I didn't respond to that one either. I want to explain my silence to you, not defend it, because I don't think it requires defense. My silence was not cruelty. It was not performance. It was not a strategy designed to punish anyone. My silence was simply the acknowledgement that I had nothing to say that would be received in good faith, and that saying it anyway would cost me something I had worked very hard to protect, which was my own equilibrium. I had built a life. I had built it carefully and largely alone, and with very little margin for the kind of destabilization that re-engaging with Vanessa would have brought. The silence was a form of self-preservation, and I refused to apologize for it. What I did not fully anticipate was that the silence, which felt to me like a door I was leaving carefully closed, was being experienced by Vanessa as a door being barricaded. That is her characterization, and I'm including it because I think it's part of the full picture, even if I do not entirely accept it. I turned 35 in Baltimore. Rosie flew in from San Francisco, where she was practicing internal medicine at UCSF. We went to an extremely good oyster restaurant and drank far too much white wine, and she gave a toast that was 8 minutes long and made me cry twice and laugh 4 times. This is the kind of birthday I had learned to have, small, chosen, real. My 36th year was the year I performed a 12-hour surgery on a 42-year-old woman with pancreatic cancer that, under different circumstances, would have been inoperable. The surgery worked. She sent me a card at 6 months post-op that said, "Because of you, I watched my daughter's wedding." I kept that card in my desk drawer. On the hard days, I would open the drawer, look at it, and close the drawer again. That was enough. My 37th year was unremarkable by surgical standards, and remarkable by personal ones. I started seeing someone seriously for the first time in years, a landscape architect named Marcus who had no connection to medicine, and who found my job fascinating in the way that people find fascinating the thing they would never choose for themselves. We dated for 14 months and then ended things mutually and without damage, which is the best possible outcome for a relationship that wasn't quite built to last. We are still genuinely friends. My 38th year, I became the director of the minimally invasive surgery division at Hopkins. Dr. Okafor attended the announcement ceremony with the expression she wore for things she was genuinely proud of, which looked almost exactly like her expression for everything else except her eyes were a fraction warmer. She shook my hand and said, "I told Paul Chen you'd end up here and he didn't believe me. That man owes me $20. I laughed for a full minute. And then, 3 months ago, my 39th year, I was sleeping in my apartment at 2:30 in the morning when my pager went off. The call came from the OR scheduling coordinator on nights, a woman named Deborah who I had known for 6 years and who communicated efficiently and without preamble at all hours, which is exactly the quality you want in someone who wakes you up at 2:30 in the morning. She said, "We have a young female 35 ruptured appendix with early peritonitis. Attending on call is Chen, but he's tied up in a multi-trauma. They're asking for you." I said I'd be there in 20 minutes. I was dressed and in my car in 7 minutes and at the hospital in 12, which if you know Baltimore traffic at 2:45 in the morning you will understand is not difficult. I scrubbed in and reviewed the imaging at the same time, which is a skill that takes years to develop and which I have always found quietly satisfying. The ability to hold multiple streams of information simultaneously without any of them degrading. The CT showed a perforated appendix with localized peritoneal soiling. Not as bad as it could be, not easy either. I walked into the OR at 3:04 a.m. My resident, a third year named Dr. James Osai, who was excellent and still in the stage of residency where he was learning that competence and confidence could coexist, was already prepped and ready. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Kim, was running through her checklist. The patient was prepped and draped. I looked at the patient's face, a reflexive habit, a humanizing moment before the anatomy becomes the focus, and I stopped. The face under the anesthesia mask, slack and vulnerable the way all faces are under general anesthesia, was my sister's face. I stood at the head of the operating table for what I know, because I checked the OR log later, was 11 seconds. 11 seconds in which I experienced something I can only describe as a compressed version of the last 7 years. Every layer of it presents simultaneously. The text message, the certified letter, the blocked phone numbers, Vanessa's face at 13 with the carnations, Vanessa's Facebook message, and the face in front of me now, vulnerable and trusting in the involuntary way of someone unconscious. Then Dr. Osai said, "Dr. McKinnon, asterisk," and I moved. I will tell you about the surgery in a moment. I want to first tell you what happened in the minutes before it started, because those minutes are as important as anything that came after. When I had stopped at the head of the table, Dr. Kim had looked up at me with a slight frown. I said quietly, "The patient is my sister." She looked at me. Dr. Osai looked at me. There was a pause. Dr. Kim said, "Do you need a different attending?" I thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Then I said, asterisk, no. Because the alternative was waking Paul Chen out of a multi-trauma to come do a laparoscopic appendectomy at 3 in the morning, and Paul Chen was 67 and had been awake for 18 hours, and my sister had a ruptured appendix and early peritonitis, and I was the best technical laparoscopic surgeon in that building at that moment. Personal history does not change the facts of a perforated viscus. "No, asterisk," I said, "I'm fine. Let's go." The surgery took 47 minutes. The appendix had ruptured, but the peritoneal soiling was well localized and the tissue quality was good, and there were no complications beyond the ones we had anticipated from the imaging. I worked cleanly and efficiently in the way that I work, without commentary, with only necessary communication, instrument requests, vital sign check-ins, the brief observations that constitute the OR's particular language. Dr. Osai was superb. Dr. Kim was flawless. When it was over, I stood in the scrub sink and let the water run over my hands for longer than necessary, which is something I do when I need a moment that the OR doesn't allow. Then I dried my hands and went to find a family. I had not thought, until I was walking toward the waiting room, about who would be there. My sister had been brought in by ambulance, which meant someone had called it. I had assumed a roommate, a friend. What I had not allowed myself to fully consider, walking through those corridors in my scrubs with the quiet of a hospital at 3:30 in the morning around me, was that the phone call might have reached further than that. My parents were sitting in the waiting room. My father was in a navy windbreaker, the kind he always wore, and his hair was entirely grey now, grey in a way that it hadn't been 7 years ago, and he looked smaller than I remembered in the way that people look smaller when you see them after time has passed, and some of the myth of them has eroded. My mother was in a blouse that she had clearly pulled on in a hurry, because it was buttoned one button off and she hadn't noticed, and her hands were folded in her lap the way she folded them when she was frightened. They didn't recognize me immediately. I was wearing scrubs and a surgical cap. I hadn't worn my hair down in a professional setting in years. It was pulled back, tucked under the cap. I had a Hopkins badge on a lanyard and I was carrying a chart. I looked like what I was, an attending surgeon at 3:30 in the morning coming to give someone news. I watched my father's face do the thing that a face does when recognition happens gradually rather than all at once. His eyes found my badge first, then my face, and then I watched something move through him that I cannot fully describe even now, surprise and disbelief, and something underneath those things that might have been relief or might have been something else entirely. My mother's hands unfolded. She put one hand over her mouth. I had rehearsed this conversation approximately 0 times because I had not known it was coming. I had, for 7 years, occasionally imagined some version of it, late at night, or in those formless moments between sleep and waking. I had constructed scenarios and speeches and things I would say if given the opportunity. None of them had taken place in a hospital waiting room at 3:30 in the morning, while I was still wearing the scrub cap from their other daughter's surgery. I sat down across from them, not next to them, across from them with the low coffee table between us. I put the chart on the table. I said as steadily as I could, "I'm Dr. McKinnon. I performed your daughter's surgery tonight. She's in recovery and she's going to be fine. The appendix ruptured, but we were able to remove it laparoscopically and address the peritoneal soiling. She'll need antibiotics for 5 to 7 days, and she should be able to go home in 2 to 3 days if there are no complications. I'll check on her in the morning." My mother was crying. My father was very still. They were both looking at me in the specific way of people who have encountered something for which they have no existing framework. My father said, "Kate." I had not been called by my name by either of my parents in 7 years. The word landed in a way I had not prepared for. I took a breath and I said, "I know who you are." "Yes." And then, because I am not built for the indefinite deferral of difficult things, I said, "There's a lot we need to talk about. But not tonight. Tonight your daughter is okay." I stood up. I picked up the chart. "A nurse will come update you on visiting hours," I said, and I walked back toward the OR wing before either of them could respond. I went to the on-call room on the 4th floor, which at that hour was empty, and I sat on the edge of the narrow bed in there, and I put my face in my hands, and I stayed exactly like that for the next 12 minutes. This is specific because I know the exact length of time because I was counting. I had learned, somewhere in the 12 years of my training, to give grief a time limit when I was working, 12 minutes and then you go back. After 12 minutes, I washed my face in the small bathroom, straightened my badge and went back to work. Vanessa was awake the next morning at 6 when I did my post-op rounds. She was in a private room, IV antibiotics running, vitals stable, the familiar disorientation of someone newly emerged from general anesthesia still present in her expression. Her hair was tangled. She had that washed-out, vulnerable look that patients always have the morning after emergency surgery, stripped of all the usual armor. She saw me and said, "Oh my God." I pulled up a chair and sat down. I had my chart. I was in attending mode, which is a register I know well, professional, precise, not cold but not warm either. I said, "How are you feeling? Any pain?" She said her abdomen hurt. I said that was expected and we'd manage it. I went through the clinical picture, the surgery, the findings, the recovery timeline, the antibiotics. I was clinical and correct and thorough. When I finished, there was a silence. Then Vanessa said, "You operated on me." "Yes." I didn't know, I couldn't, I wasn't awake when they brought me in. She stopped. "Was that okay that you did it?" I considered the question. "You needed surgery," I said. "I was the surgeon available. The outcome was good." She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes were the same dark brown as our father's, the same dark brown as mine. She said, "Kate," asterisk, and her voice had something in it that I recognized, a particular unsteadiness that means someone is about to say something they've been carrying. I held up one hand. "Not yet," I said. "You're 24 hours post-op. Rest." I stood. "I'll come back this afternoon." I went out and spent the morning in the OR on a scheduled colectomy that I had agreed to assist on weeks earlier, and I was entirely present for it the way I have learned to be entirely present when I'm operating. You cannot be in two places in an OR. Your hands are there, your mind is there, your judgment is there. The colectomy went smoothly. At noon, I called Rosie. Rosie is 3 hours behind Baltimore, so it was 9 in the morning in San Francisco, and she was on her way to the hospital. And when I told her what had happened, she was silent for 3 full seconds, which is a long time for Rosie. Then she said, "Of course you did. Of course you were the surgeon." And then, "How are you?" I said I didn't know yet. She said that was the correct answer. She said, "You don't have to talk to them if you're not ready." I said I knew. She said, "And you don't have to forgive anything yet either. You can just hold it." I said I knew that too. She said, "I'm going to call you tonight," and she did. I went back to Vanessa's room at 2 in the afternoon. My parents were there. My mother was sitting in the chair beside the bed. My father was standing by the window, the same windbreaker. Vanessa was sitting up, her hair still tangled, looking from them to me with an expression that I can only describe as someone caught in the middle, which I suppose she was. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I came in and put Vanessa's chart on the end of the bed and said, "Vitals are good, you're looking better. Are you in pain?" She said, "Minimal." I said, "Good." Then there was a silence that none of us moved to fill for approximately 8 seconds, and I have learned in 12 years of telling families difficult things that 8 seconds of silence in a small room is a very long time. My mother said, "Kate, I said, "I'm listening," not encouraging, not harsh, just "I'm listening." My mother pressed her lips together. She said, "I don't know how to, I don't know where to start." She looked very old, or maybe I was just looking at her clearly for the first time in a long time without the softening effect of wanting her approval. She said, "We were so wrong. We were so wrong, Kate, and I need you to know." I said, "I know you were wrong. I've known that for 7 years." My voice was even. I called 14 times. The first 3 calls to your number went to voicemail. By the 4th, my number was blocked. Dad's numbers were blocked by day 6. I sent emails that were not answered. I sent a certified letter with documentation from Hopkins confirming that I was in good standing and had not been disciplined. It came back unopened. I had my Aunt Carol try to reach you. You told her you couldn't deal with it. I paused. That's the record. My father had turned from the window. His face had the look of a man absorbing information he already knew, but had successfully avoided looking at directly for a very long time. He said quietly, "Yes." I said, "I'm not saying this to punish you. I'm saying it because if we are going to talk about this honestly, we need to start from what actually happened, not from what it's comfortable to remember." Vanessa said from the bed, Kate. Her voice had that same unsteadiness from the morning, but more of it now and something else under it. "I need to say something." I looked at her. She said, "I told them you were fired. I told them you stole medication. That wasn't true. None of it was true." Her voice broke slightly on the last sentence. "And I've known for 7 years that I need to tell them, and I kept not doing it, and then it became." She stopped. Her hands were folded over the blanket. "I don't have an excuse," she said. "I know I don't have an excuse." The room was very quiet. My mother made a sound that was not quite a word. I looked at Vanessa. I thought about the carnations at the piano recital. I thought about the Facebook message. "I don't know if that matters to you. It does to me." I thought about the 7 years, the specific texture of them. Not tragedy, not ruin, but a life lived on a narrower track than it might have been, a life built without the safety net that family is supposed to provide. I thought about the 12 minutes in the on-call room with my face in my hands. I said, "I know," 2 words, "I know," and then, "Thank you for saying it now." My father sat down on the windowsill with the weight of a much older man. He put his hand over his eyes. My mother was crying quietly in the way she cried, not dramatically, just steadily like a slow leak. Vanessa was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, an expression stripped of performance, just bare and exhausted and waiting. I said, "I don't know what comes next. I haven't had the time to think about what comes next. What I know is that I'm your doctor for the next 2 days, Vanessa, and that I'm going to do that job well regardless of anything else." I picked up the chart, and I know that if there's going to be anything after this, I need it to be honest, not managed, not comfortable, just honest. My father said yes, his voice was rough. "Yes, whatever you need, Katie." I nodded. I said, "I'll be back this evening," and I left. The next 36 hours were some of the strangest of my life. I was operating in 2 registers simultaneously, the clinical and the personal, the attending and the daughter, and they were running in parallel without fully merging. I would check Vanessa's vitals and review her labs, and discuss her antibiotic course with the nursing team with complete professional competence. And then I would sit in the elevator on the way back to the surgical floor and feel something large and formless moving through my chest that I could not entirely name. What I could identify and what surprised me was that anger was not the dominant feeling. People expect, I think, that a person who has been wronged for 7 years would feel primarily angry when confronted with the source of the wrong. What I felt was closer to grief, with a current of something that might eventually, at some future point, become relief. The anger had been metabolized over years, slowly, imperfectly, but metabolized. What remained was not the hot burning of fresh injury, but the dull, compressed ache of something that had calcified and now needed to be broken up, carefully in pieces, so it could finally pass through. I thought about Dr. Okafor's words from my first year of residency, "Let it look easy." I had built an entire professional identity around that instruction, around the ability to contain and redirect. For the first time in a long time, I needed to do the opposite. I needed to let myself feel it, not perform it, not display it, but actually sit with it. I told Dr. Okaffer. I stopped by her office on the afternoon of Vanessa's second post-op day and knocked on her open door and said, I need to tell you something that is going to sound like a TV movie. She looked up from her computer, folded her hands and said, sit down. I sat down and told her the whole thing, the estrangement, the surgery, my parents in the waiting room. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, how did you handle it in the OR? I told her I had handled it correctly. She said, I know you did, I'm asking how you handled it. I told her about the 11 seconds at the head of the table. She nodded, she said, that's good. 11 seconds is good, I once needed 14. She paused. You navigated something most surgeons never have to navigate, and you did it well. And then typically, practically, you should talk to someone, not me, a professional someone. I said I had a therapist I saw occasionally and she said, good, see them this week. I said I would. On the afternoon of Vanessa's second post-op day, after I had reviewed her imaging and confirmed that the resolution was proceeding as expected, I sat down in her room when my parents were not there. I had timed it so we were alone, and I had a longer conversation with her than the ones we'd been having. Not the medical kind, the other kind. I said, I want to understand something. You reached out twice in 7 years, once a text, once on Facebook. What was that? She looked at her hands. She said, I don't know. Guilt, I think, maybe hopping you would. She stopped. Respond in a way that let me know you were okay without me having to say anything. You wanted absolution without confession. She looked up. Yes, asterisk, she said, that's exactly what I wanted. She paused. I know how that sounds. I said, it sounds human, because it does. It sounds like something most people would want if they were brave enough to admit it. I said, why didn't you tell them the truth? In 7 years, what were you afraid of? She was quiet for a long time. Then she said that they would choose you, that if they knew what I'd done they would choose you and I would lose them. Her voice was steady but her hands were not. And then time kept going and it became, the thing that couldn't be undone became the thing I couldn't explain, and explaining it would have meant losing everything. I thought you were, she stopped. I thought you were fine. I knew you were in medicine. I knew you were successful. I told myself you were fine. I said I was fine. I built a fine life. That's not the same as being okay. She said, I know that now. She looked at me, I'm sorry, I know that's not enough. She said it the way someone says it who understands precisely what they're saying, not as a transaction, not as a request to be forgiven on the spot, but as a statement of fact. This is what I have. This is what I am offering. I know it is not enough. I said, it's a start, 2 words again, the same ones I keep coming back to, it's a start. My parents came to see me the evening of Vanessa's second post-op day. We sat in the small family consultation room down the hall from Vanessa's room, a room with beige walls and neutral art and chairs that are designed for the kind of conversations that require a certain amount of privacy. My mother had a piece of paper in her hands, folded in quarters. My father sat next to her with his hands on his knees. My mother said I wrote some things down because I knew I would forget them or say them wrong if I didn't. She unfolded the paper. Her handwriting was the same careful cursive I remembered from birthday cards. She said, I want to tell you that I know what we did. Not just the letter and the phone calls, I know about those, I mean all of it, the piano recital, the science fair, the ways she stopped, restarted, the ways we didn't see you, she looked up. Her eyes were red but her voice was mostly steady. I don't know when we started, I don't know how we got to a place where it was so easy to believe another stop. I think we were afraid of you, Katie, not you but what you were becoming, how far you were going. It was easier to love Vanessa because she stayed close and she needed us, and loving you felt like watching something leave, something we didn't know how to follow. I sat with that. I want to be careful here because this is the part of the story where it would be easy to tip into a resolution that is cleaner than the truth. My mother's words were real and I believe she meant them. They were also, I was aware, only a partial map of the territory. There were years of distance between her words and my full understanding of them. What I felt sitting in that beige consultation room was not forgiveness, not yet, not close, but something that might have been the beginning of willingness to understand. A cracking open rather than an opening. I said, I hear you. I said, I need you to know that the years I lived without you were not nothing. They were real years. I built something real. I don't need you to be there for that to be true. I looked at my father. But I also don't want to spend the next 30 years living as if this conversation never happened, and I don't want to spend them pretending it resolved anything cleanly. Because it didn't. My father said, what do you need from us? He said it directly without ornamentation, and I appreciated that. He had always been better at the direct question than at the indirect feeling. I said, I need honesty. Not managed honesty, actual honesty. I need you to stop. I thought about how to say it. I need you to stop curating your relationship with me. I'm not a good story for the family to tell at dinner. I'm a person. I made a life without you. I would like to know if there's something possible here now, but only if we're starting from what's real. My mother said yes, simply without qualification. Yes, whatever you need. I said, I also need you to say to each other out loud what happened. Not just to me, to each other. Because I had been thinking about the mechanics of it, the way families sustain damage by refusing to name it, by smoothing it into acceptable narrative. My parents had spent 7 years, presumably, managing a story in which they had made a difficult decision about a troubled daughter. That story needed to be dismantled before anything could be rebuilt. My father looked at my mother. My mother looked at her hands, then back at him. He said we believed the worst of our child because it was easier than doing the work to find out the truth. He said it slowly, like someone reading from a document in a language he's just learned. We abandoned Katie because Vanessa, he stopped. Then, no, because we chose to. Vanessa told us something and we chose to believe it. He looked at me. That was our choice, not Vanessa's, ours. I nodded. I said, keep that. Don't let it get softer over time. We sat for a while longer. My mother asked careful questions about my life, not the catalogue of achievements, not the resume, but actual questions. Did I like where I lived? Did I have people? Was I happy in the way that I meant when I used the word happy, not the surface-level way? I answered carefully and honestly. Yes to the first, yes to the second in the ways that mattered, and for the third I said, I think happy is a complicated word for someone who lives the way I live. I'm present. I'm doing work that matters to me. I have people I love. I looked at her. It's a good life. She said, I'm glad, and she meant it. I could tell she meant it, and the telling of it cost her something, which I think is what made it real. I want to be honest about the days and weeks that followed, because they were not a resolution. They were an opening, messy and uncertain, and occasionally painful in new ways that I had not anticipated. Vanessa was discharged on her 3rd post-op day. My parents were with her. I had cleared my afternoon and I walked them to the exit, the 4 of us navigating the Hopkins corridors together for the first time in 39 years, which felt both mundane and enormous. My mother reached out and put her hand briefly on my arm near the elevator, just for a moment, and I let her. That was the most physical contact we'd had in 7 years, and it was a brief pressure of a hand on a forearm in a hospital corridor, and it mattered more than I expected it to. At the exit, Vanessa turned and looked at me. She was still moving carefully, still slightly hunched against the abdominal soreness that would last another week. She said, thank you for the surgery. I said it was my job. She said, I know. But it was also, she didn't finish the sentence. I let it remain unfinished because I thought the unfinished version was more accurate. My father shook my hand. He held it for a moment before releasing it, not a hug, not a demonstrative gesture, but a holding. My father had never been a hugger. This, I understood, was his version of a hug, and I received it as such. My mother did hug me briefly, and I felt her thin shoulders under my hands and remembered involuntarily what it felt like to be held by her when I was small. Before the science fairs and the piano recitals and all the forgettings. I did not cry until they were in the parking garage. I stood outside the Hopkins main entrance for approximately 3 minutes, then went back inside. There was a scheduled case in 2 hours. I went to the Or Lounge and had a coffee and called Rosie and told her what had happened, and she listened the whole way through. When I finished, she said, that's a lot, Kate. I said yes. She said, are you okay? I said I thought so, in the same way I'd answered my mother, present, doing necessary things in a good life. Rosie said, I'm coming to Baltimore next month. I said, you don't have to. She said, I'm coming to Baltimore next month. That was 6 weeks ago. In the 6 weeks since we have talked, my parents and I, 5 times on the phone. These conversations have been careful and tentative in the way of people learning a new language, which is, in a sense, what we are doing. My mother asks about my cases in the way she asks about things she's genuinely trying to understand rather than things she's trying to fill air with. My father asks about the hospital, about the division, with an engineer's interest in systems and structures. There are silences that are sometimes comfortable and sometimes not. There are moments where someone starts a sentence that edges toward the past and then redirects, and I notice those redirections and decide, each time, whether to follow the redirect or not. Twice I have not redirected. Twice I have said, I need to say something about that. And each time my parents have stayed on the line and listened. This is, I want to be clear, not small. For people who spent 7 years refusing to listen, staying on the line and listening is a significant act. Vanessa texted me 4 days after her discharge. The text said, "I'm starting therapy. I wanted you to know." I read it twice and then typed back, "Good." She sent back a single thumbs up emoji. This is the entirety of our direct communication since the hospital. It is somehow more than we've managed in 7 years. 3 weeks ago, my mother called and asked if I would come to Columbus for a Sunday dinner. She said it haltingly, carefully, with qualifications built in. Only if you want to, and only when you're ready, and I understand if you're not. I said I would think about it. I did think about it for 3 days, turning it over with the same methodical attention I bring to a complicated surgical case. What are the risks? What is the benefit? What is the most conservative approach that still allows for the best possible outcome? I called her back and said I would come for one Sunday in late spring. Not a weekend, just a Sunday, just dinner. I said I needed to be able to leave when I needed to leave. She said of course. She said she was glad. I could hear her holding back something larger and being deliberate about not releasing it, which was exactly the right instinct, and I was glad she had it. 2 weeks ago I sat in my therapist's office. Her name is Dr. Wells, and I have been seeing her intermittently for 4 years, and I tried to describe what the last 2 months had felt like. I said, I thought I had fully processed this. I thought the 7 years had done the work. She said, had they? I said, most of the work, the functional work, but I think there was a part of me that had just compressed it, stored it somewhere I didn't have to look. She said, and now you're looking. I said, now I'm looking. What I'm looking at is complicated and not fully resolved, and I don't expect it to be fully resolved anytime soon. What I'm looking at is a family that failed me in very specific and very documented ways, and that is now, tentatively, imperfectly at their own pace and mine, trying to understand what that failure cost. What I'm looking at is a sister who was capable of a deep betrayal, and who is, apparently, also capable of something else, of the kind of courage it takes to say, out loud, in a hospital bed to the person you harmed, I did this. I am telling you I did this. That's not nothing. That doesn't erase the 7 years, but it's not nothing. What I'm looking at is also myself, 39 years old in a life I built from a fairly narrow foundation with a lot of careful, solitary work. I am looking at the question of whether I am willing to let it be a wider foundation now. Not because I owe them that, not because they deserve it, but because I might want it. Because the cost of keeping every door locked isn't always visible until someone offers to knock, and you realize that the locked doors are costing you too. I don't know yet what this becomes. I want to be careful not to tell you that I do, because I think the stories we tell about family reconciliation are often dishonestly tidy. They end with the hug and the tears and the resolution, and they don't tell you about the phone calls 3 weeks later that still feel strained, or the dinner where someone says something small and wrong, and the old injury flares briefly before you redirect it, or the years of rebuilding that look less like construction and more like archaeology. Careful, slow. Frequently stopping to examine what you found before proceeding. What I know is this. I am going to go to Columbus in late spring for Sunday dinner. My mother is going to cook something she's been preparing for weeks, probably, with the care she gives to things she's trying to communicate through rather than with. My father is going to ask me about the hospital and try, in his particular way, to show that he's paying attention. Vanessa may or may not be there. If she is there, we will be careful with each other, in the way of people who have survived something together and are not yet sure what to do with the survival. We will sit at a table together, 4 people with a long, complicated history, and we will have dinner. It will not be perfect. It will not be the dinner that makes up for the piano recital, or the science fair, or 7 years of silence. It will be 4 plates of food and 4 people at a table, and the fragile, real, imperfect attempt to begin something new on the ruins of something that failed. I think that might be enough, not more than that. Not a Hollywood resolution, not a miracle, not a story with a clean ending that wraps the pain in something useful. Just 4 plates, just present. Just beginning. Here is what the last 7 years taught me, distilled as carefully as I can distill it, from 39 years of evidence. The truth doesn't expire. It doesn't soften or diffuse over time, even when everyone around it is pretending otherwise. My sister knew for 7 years what the truth was. My parents knew, somewhere beneath the comfortable narrative, that they had failed the most basic test of parenthood, which is to give your child the benefit of the doubt before you give them your verdict. The truth was there all along, waiting. It doesn't need to be spoken to exist. It just becomes more expensive to carry the longer you don't put it down. The other thing I learned is this: you can grieve a family you still have. The estrangement of the living is, in some ways, harder than loss to death, because it is a loss that has a face, that makes choices, that is technically reachable by phone. For 7 years I grieved parents who were alive, and a sister I could have texted, and a relationship that existed only in the conditional tense, what it might have been, what it still could become. That grief is real, and it is allowed, and it deserves the same care that any grief deserves. I learned that the people who choose you, who show up without obligation, who hold your story without trying to manage it, are not a consolation prize. They are the actual prize. Rosie is one of the great gifts of my life. Dr. Okafor shaped me in ways that my parents, for all their love, never had the emotional bandwidth to. These relationships did not replace what I lost. They are different in kind, and they are, in certain crucial ways, more nourishing, because they are built entirely on choice. I learned that being good at your job is not a substitute for being known as a person. For years I poured the need to be seen into being excellent, and excellence is wonderful and meaningful, and I stand by every hour of work I put into it, but excellence cannot hold you the way a person can. Excellence does not call you on Sunday morning. Excellence does not fly across the country because you've had a hard month. Excellence is its own reward and nothing else. It took me a long time to understand the difference between being accomplished and being loved, and to understand that I was allowed to want both. I learned that you can do the right thing in the middle of your worst moment. I stood at the head of that operating table for 11 seconds, and then I operated. I did not let the history between me and my sister become part of the surgical field. This is not because I am a particularly noble person. It is because I understand, in my bones, in my hands, that the person on the table trusts you with something irreplaceable, and that trust is not conditional on your feelings about them. Every patient I have ever operated on has my full attention and my best judgment. That will not change. What I learned from those 11 seconds specifically is that you can hold two things at once. You can love and resent the same person. You can be furious at someone and still protect them. You can be devastated by your history and still competent in your present. These are not contradictions. These are the actual shape of human experience, and the people who tell you otherwise have not yet been tested in the way that clarifies things. And finally, I learned that forgiveness is not a feeling. It is not the warmth that spreads through you when someone apologizes correctly. It is not the resolution of an old tension. Forgiveness, in my experience, is a decision that you make not once but repeatedly, every morning maybe, or every time the old injury flares, to not let the past be the only thing. To make room in the present for something different, even when the present is uncertain, and the something different is only beginning to be visible. I have not fully forgiven my family. I want to be honest about that. I am in the process of deciding over and over whether I am willing to make room. Some mornings the answer is yes, easily, and I can feel the future we might have being possible. Some mornings the answer is not yet, and I need to let that be true without making it mean something permanent. Both of those are allowed. Both of those are part of the thing. My name is Kate McKinnon, and I am 39 years old. I am a surgeon at Johns Hopkins, director of minimally invasive surgery, a person with good hands and decent judgment, and a life I built from the ground up with very little help and a great deal of stubborn work. I have a friend who calls me every Sunday morning and who is, by any reasonable definition, the best person I know. I have a mentor who shaped me more than she'll ever accept credit for. I have an apartment 3 blocks from the water with a badly painted landscape I love unreasonably. I have a small, carefully maintained file in my desk drawer of cards from patients that I open on the hard days, and it is never insufficient. I have now tentatively and with conditions and with both hands open but ready to pull back if necessary, the beginnings of a family again. Not the family I was supposed to have, not the family from the version of my childhood that might have been possible under different circumstances, but this one, real, imperfect, trying, 4 plates, a table. And I have, somewhere under all of it, the 12-year-old who sat in her bedroom after her room was painted and cried for a brother she barely remembered, who learned very early that grief has to go somewhere, and that sometimes it goes into work, and sometimes it goes into silence, and sometimes, if you are patient enough and careful enough and willing enough, it goes into something that looks, in the dim light of a complicated morning, a little like peace. If you are reading this, and you know what it is to be invisible inside your own family, To do everything right and still be passed over, to achieve and still not be seen, to love people who are not yet capable of loving you back in the way you need. I want to tell you something I needed to hear for a very long time. Stop waiting for them to see you before you see yourself. That's the first and most important thing. You don't need their recognition to be real. Your accomplishments are real. Your life is real. Your grief is real. You are allowed to be all of these things before anyone in your family acknowledges them. You are also allowed to want reconciliation. You are allowed to leave the door ajar, not open, not unguarded, but ajar so that the possibility exists without demanding the probability. Conditions are not cruelty. Requirements are not punishment. I need honesty, not management. I need you to say it out loud. I need to be able to leave when I need to leave. These are not unreasonable demands. These are the basic requirements of a real relationship, and you are allowed to hold them. You are allowed to grieve what was lost and still show up for what remains. You are allowed to say it's a start and mean it as both the most and the least you are willing to give right now. You are allowed to heal slowly, incompletely in your own time, without a deadline, without a performance, without doing it in a way that makes anyone else more comfortable. The truth was always yours. It was never theirs to take, even when they tried. It was just waiting, quiet and permanent in the record of every call made and every letter sent, and every unreturned piece of yourself that you offered and had handed back. It was waiting in you, in the work you did, in the life you built. It was there in the operating room at 3 a.m. when you chose to help the person who had hurt you, not because you owed her anything, but because she needed help and you had the hands for it, and that was enough. That was always enough. Hold what you've built, hold it carefully, let some light in when you're ready and not before. 4 plates, it's a start.